Welcome to our show, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again.
As my first question, Afghan people want to know about the NATO presence in Afghanistan, and how do you see for a long term the presence of the NATO in Afghanistan?
Well, of course, as you know, we've increased our presence very substantially in the past year. There are now nearly 150,000 NATO and ISAF forces here in Afghanistan. And that was in order to try and regain the initiative against the insurgency, and I believe we've done that. The transition process that President Karzai announced just a couple of weeks ago will begin this spring, and over the next 3 years, gradually will reduce both the profile and the number of those troops as we build up the Afghan forces, and so the Afghan forces can take responsibilities for security throughout the country. And we aim to complete that by the end of 2014. But NATO will be here after 2014. We have an enduring partnership agreement with Afghanistan that was signed back at the Lisbon summit in the autumn that President Karzai attended. And we'll be here to support the Afghan security forces, to partner with them in special forces operations, to deal with the terrorist threat, the threats of the drugs traffickers and so on for many, many years to come. And of course, on the civilian side, there will be development aid for decades, and indeed funding and support for the government to secure and govern itself. We want the Afghan people to take charge of their own destiny, support the Afghan security forces, to partner with them in special forces operations, to deal with the terrorist threat, the threats of the drugs traffickers and so on for many, many years to come. And of course, on the civilian side,
the priority for the NATO in Afghanistan is, what is the priority? Are they focused on fighting against terrorism, or do you think these priorities now change?
Well, the priority for us in the end is to help build an Afghanistan that can secure and govern itself. We want the Afghan people to take charge of their own destiny, but to do so in a country that is at peace and that has the capability of securing its own borders against threats from outside and indeed internal threats too. Now, of course, that is because the threat of terrorism that exists in the lawless border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan directly threatens us. But it's also because this is an important region, and we need stability in this region in our own national security interest. So although we often talk about terrorism, we often talk about regional stability, for us, an Afghanistan that can secure and govern itself is a critical pillar of that overall approach, and that's what people to take charge of their own destiny, but to do so in a country the Afghans built.
But Mr. Ambassador, did you think still for NATO fighting terrorism is the priority?
Well, fighting terrorism is the reason we came to Afghanistan in the first place in 2001. And of course, that's a critical part of what we're doing here, directly fighting terrorism. But we know that we can only fight terrorism effectively in the long term if Afghanistan itself is capable of dealing with that threat, securing its own territory, securing the people of Afghanistan, governing them well, and preventing the extremist groups within which terrorism breeds from re-entering Afghan political life. So we need a stable Afghanistan. A stable Afghanistan means a safer Britain, a safer America, a safer Europe, and a safer world. And that's what we're here to build. People of Afghanistan, governing them well, and preventing the extremist groups within which terrorism breeds.
Most of people in Afghanistan think that the international perspective toward the Taliban is now it's changed, and people see the new face of the NATO and the U.S. policies about Afghanistan, especially towards the talking with the dialogue with the Taliban. And people asking the same question, that if you want to sit and talk to the Taliban, so then why you are fighting terrorism?
Well, in conflicts of this kind, it is usually the case, in fact invariably the case, that fighting and talking proceed together, at least for a while. We support the Afghan government's desire to reach...
Mr. Ambassador, if you agree to talk to the Taliban, so then why? What's the need to fight Taliban or terrorism?
Well, it is usually the case that in conflicts of this kind, fighting and talking proceed together, at least for some time, as we all work to bring the conflict to the end. In the end, the only reason that we are fighting in Afghanistan, and indeed that the Afghan security forces are fighting in Afghanistan, is to secure the people. And we're only fighting because the Taliban are trying to take over the territory of Afghanistan and enforce their will on the people of Afghanistan and turn the clock back to the kind of brutal medieval regime that they imposed back in the 1990s. Now, President Karzai, the government, the High Peace Council have all made clear that they want to give those Taliban, those insurgents, those disaffected compatriots who are willing to do so, the chance to re-enter normal Afghan life and become part of a more positive future. And we support that because in the end, we want Afghanistan to be at peace with itself, and this is the best opportunity to achieve that. But the choice is theirs. The fighting will end if they stop fighting. The talking will begin when they're ready to talk. Here that they want to give those Taliban, those insurgents, those disaffected compatriots who are willing to do so, the chance to re-enter normal Afghan life. The fighting will end if they stop fighting. The talking will begin when they're ready to talk.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, did you think the whole NATO countries have a united or unanimous approach towards the dialogue with Taliban?
Absolutely. The entire alliance has made clear time after time that we support the government's policy of reaching out and giving talks and peace a chance here. And we support the High Peace Council. Indeed, we have put a great deal of time and money and effort into helping fund the reintegration program that is now bringing fighters back into normal Afghan lives. In the last few months alone, hundreds of fighters have laid down their weapons and taken up a normal life, and probably 2,000 or more are beginning to enter the process. And that's been with our direct support. So the entire alliance is behind this effort.
Yeah. People think that the UK is more focused on a dialogue with Taliban rather than the US, because the US government think that Taliban are still the threat and they should remove them or at least bring them to the age of that at least they will lose the power and then they can be part of the peace process.
Now, everybody agrees that we need a political effort to try and bring peace to Afghanistan, and indeed the most prominent speech given on that effort was by Hillary Clinton, the United States Secretary of State, just a few weeks ago at the Asia Society in New York, where she called for a political surge to reach out to the Taliban, to try and improve regional stability, to create the right conditions for a reconciliation process with the Taliban. So I think you'll find that the American government, the British government, and indeed governments right the way across the alliance are firmly supporting this peace effort.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, how much are you optimistic about the dialogue with the Taliban?
Well, I think this depends on them. I believe that we can do a great deal within Afghanistan to address the grievances and the conflicts that down there at the grassroots levels, out in Helmand, in Kandahar, in Baghdad, in other areas, that really fuel the insurgency. As you know, most insurgents fight within their own district. They fight within a few miles of their own homes. And most of them fight for local reasons. And the Taliban have exploited that. So through the reintegration program, through helping the provincial peace councils work on conflict resolution locally and grievance resolution locally, through improving governance, I think we can do a great deal. We can also do a great deal in terms of helping build relationships within the region. We know that the historic distrust between Afghanistan and Pakistan has hampered peace efforts in the past, and we must overcome that for a peace process to work. Whether the peace process to the core Taliban works is in the end up to them, and whether they're ready to talk and stop fighting.
Did you think, Mr. Ambassador, from your experience, you spent a long time in Afghanistan, did you think that one day Mullah Omar, the Taliban supreme leader, will be ready to talk to the Afghan government?
Well, that's a decision for him. Personally, I'm skeptical. I've seen no sign that he's willing to do so. I think he's sitting in comfort in a villa somewhere or a house somewhere in the lawless border areas of Pakistan, and he's trying to keep a fight going that he isn't putting himself or any of his own family at risk in. And I think he would like to continue with that. Now, let's see if he's willing to enter the peace process, if he's willing to bring his fighters back into a normal life in Afghanistan, then I would welcome that. So far, I haven't seen any sign of it, and so far, regrettably, well, it's not a question of whether we're satisfied. We have to recognize that the government and forces of Pakistan have
the root cause of the terrorism in the Taliban, most of the people in Afghanistan, even the Afghan government, criticize the Pakistani government that some element under the ISI and some element of the Pakistani army, they have a relation with the Taliban leader, and they see the root cause of the terrorism outside of Afghanistan. And how do you see this problem,
well, I think
problem of terrorism in Afghanistan?
I think it has many causes, and clearly the sanctuaries outside Afghanistan are a critical component of this. And we have to see effective action against the madrasas, against the leadership in those sanctuaries, if we really are to be able to bring this insurgency to an end. And the Pakistani forces are fighting very hard to try and bring those areas back under control, because of course they have their own terrorist problem within Pakistan. And 2,500 Pakistani soldiers have died in the past few years fighting against this threat within Pakistan. But there's no question that that is one of the root problems that we have to deal with. But there are many problems within Afghanistan as well, and we have to tackle those too, whether those are local tribal disputes, ethnic disputes, whether it's the fact that warlords have captured the government institutions.
Are you satisfied with the efforts of the Pakistani government to hunt down the Al-Qaeda in the Taliban groups in Pakistan?
Well, it's not a question of whether we're satisfied. We have to recognize that the government and forces of Pakistan have a very serious fight on their hands. As I said, they've lost 2,500 of their own soldiers in this fight. And it's not straightforward. We found it very, very hard within Afghanistan, with all of the assets that NATO brings, with now a very substantial Afghan security force of 250,000 soldiers and policemen to deal with the problem in Afghanistan. So, of course, we'd like to see Pakistan do more. We'd like to see them do the absolute maximum they can to bring this problem to an end. But we must also recognize just what a very serious fight they have on their hands and how much they've sacrificed so far.
Yeah. What would be your response towards the President Karzai demand that he asked the international community, if they want to fight terrorism, they should go beyond the boundaries and hunt down the Taliban from their sanctuaries in Pakistan?
Well, I've said already, the sanctuaries are a very serious issue, and of course we need to take action there. And the international community is providing a lot of support to the Pakistani forces, which is a very substantial armed force, the biggest army in this part of the world, in this part of the Muslim world, to tackle that threat within Pakistan's borders. And there's military aid, there's civilian aid, and some very direct relationships with Pakistan in order to try and achieve that, including intelligence exchange. But we mustn't ignore that much of the threat also arises within Afghanistan itself, and we have to deal with the problem both here and across the border in the sanctuaries.
Did you think, Mr. Ambassador, Pakistan will take more measures to hunt down the Taliban and remove their sanctuaries, especially from North Waziristan?
Well, I think we're seeing the Pakistani forces continuing the fight within Pakistan, continuing to try and tackle all of the sanctuaries, including North Waziristan. And as I said, they've sacrificed many troops in doing so. So I think that effort will continue. And clearly it is critical not only for Afghanistan, but for Pakistan's own security, and indeed the wider security of the region and the world, that they do continue that effort. And the more that we can do to cooperate with each other, to share intelligence on different groups, to ensure that we're all working together and targeting the same groups, the better that will be. So yes, we need to do more here in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis need to do more in Pakistan until we bring this threat to an end. For Afghanistan, but for Pakistan's own security, and indeed the wider security of the region in Pakistan until we bring this threat to an end.
Do you think the international community will put more pressure on Pakistan to do more and try to remove the Taliban safe havens from
the international community will continue with its very robust engagement with Pakistan and continue to support Pakistan in dealing with the threat that exists within their borders, just as we'll continue with our engagement in Afghanistan to deal with the threat that exists here. In the end, this is a threat that faces us all. It isn't just happening in sanctuaries in Pakistan. It exists in Afghanistan too, and we have to deal with it wherever it arises. With its very robust engagement with Pakistan and continue to support Pakistan.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, Afghan people want to know, as a NATO civilian ambassador in Afghanistan, when you feel that you lost your soldiers in Afghanistan, in some point you find out that these terrorist group came from outside of the country. So how much it hurt you, or how much you want to put a pressure on Pakistan to at least deal with this, to reduce the number of casualties?
Well, you're kind of suggesting that Pakistan can just simply turn a tap on or off of this, and that simply isn't true. They have a very tough fight on their hands dealing with this threat within their own borders. And of course, every loss of a NATO soldier, of an Afghan soldier, of an Afghan civilian, of a Pakistani soldier, a Pakistani civilian, is a tragedy for the family of the person who's been killed, or indeed someone who's been injured in this conflict. We're all fighting to try and eradicate this threat of violent militancy, which gives itself the name of Islam, but which of course is not true to the nature of Islam, to root this out and to bring stability and security to Afghanistan, stability and security to Pakistan, and thus safety to the wider world. And that's a fight.
2014, it's a target to hand over the whole security responsibilities to the Afghan forces. How do you see the growth of the Afghan army and Afghan police in Afghanistan?
Well, I think they're making good progress. Altogether, they're now over 250,000 strong, the army and the police together. By the end of this year, they will be over 300,000 strong. And by the end of next year, it will be something like 350 to 370,000 strong. And we believe that a security force of, broadly speaking, that size, army, police, local police, intelligence services, commando forces and so on, will be able to deal with the continuing security threats that will face Afghanistan after 2014, underwritten with our long-term support. And that long-term support is guaranteed. We've always made that clear. So we think they're on track. They still need to develop their leadership, their capability and so on, because they're still growing. But we believe by 2014 they will be capable of dealing with the threats internal and
Afghan army and Afghan police in Afghanistan.
Well, I think they're making good progress. Altogether, they're now over 250,000 to this country.
The official of the both ministries, Interior and Ministry of Defense, they're complaining about the heavy weaponry. And they are complaining that still they don't have any clear sort of like a plan to when and where the international NATO and international troops will hand over these sorts of weapons to them to start a fight against Taliban and have actively control over the borders or some areas which they will take responsibilities.
Well, heavy weaponry may not be appropriate for a lot of the tasks that the Afghan security forces are facing. The idea is to try and secure the people and to be working among the Afghan people. And of course, heavy weaponry clearly increases the risks to the ordinary Afghan
helicopters,
civilian.
gunship helicopters, tanks.
Yeah, we are supplying those, and we're training the Afghan forces in how to use helicopters and so on. Tanks is a different matter, but how to use helicopters and other sophisticated equipment of that kind. What we've focused on in the last couple of years is growing the Afghan security forces so that they have the size to deal with the threats they face. As they mature, what we want to do is try and increase their capabilities, including the Air Force capabilities, including the capabilities of their armoured units and so on, and produce a properly balanced force. Now, we'll supply equipment, and the Afghan government will buy equipment as well. But we have to ensure that the equipment they have and the way they're configured is appropriate to the threats that they are designed to face. And most of the threats that they are designed to face exist within Afghanistan's borders. Yeah,
Mr. Ambassador, some official of the Ministry of Defense, they think that somehow the foreign elements, or especially the Pakistani government is not happy with the way that the international community wants, or NATO wants to raise the number of the Afghan army or provide them with the tanks, helicopters, or these things. Do you think it's true or not?
Well, I think it's in everybody's interest, including Pakistan's interest. I'm sure you could find somebody in Pakistan who would say they're not happy with that, just as I'm sure you could find someone in Afghanistan who would say the same.
But how much impact it will have?
But the point is, it is in Pakistan's interest that Afghanistan is stable. And General Kayani, the chief of their army staff, President Zardari, Prime Minister Gilani, the entire leadership has made clear that they recognize that a stable Afghanistan is in the interests of Pakistan, because they have this very serious threat of their own of violent militancy. It's killed a lot of Pakistanis, it's killed a lot of their soldiers. And if Afghanistan is unstable, that threat continues. So of course it's in their interests that Afghanistan has the forces able to stabilize this country, and the leadership of Pakistan have made that clear.
Mr. Ambassador, most of the time we see that NATO countries, somehow they are not happy with the performance of the Afghan government. Some of them are criticizing even they are against the presence of their troops in Afghanistan, and they see Karzai is not a reliable partner to themselves. What's your experience?
Well, the Afghan government has a very serious task on its hands, and of course there are areas where we would like to have seen more progress than there has been. For example, of the Kabul conference commitments made by the Afghan government almost a year ago now, too many have still not been fulfilled. And while we understand there are very serious questions over capability within the Afghan government, that's still being built, there are other areas where progress could have been made and more action could have been taken. The Deputy Attorney General just this week talked about the problems of corruption and how difficult it is for somebody in his job to tackle those. The new Chairman of the High Office of Oversight, Dr. Ludin, has made the same point. So those are areas where I'm very pleased to see that people are those people in those jobs are clearly serious about tackling these problems. But those are areas, for example, where there hasn't been sufficient action in the past, and we want to see more of it now, not least because that means that the funding we give to Afghanistan, the funding we want to put through the Afghan government, we know will reach the people who it's designed to help.
But Mr. Ambassador, did you see any progress especially on the issue of the fighting corruption in Afghanistan?
Well, I think we've seen some progress, but it's been patchy. For example, there's been very substantial progress in dealing with corruption within the customs service, and of course, by dealing with that corruption at the borders, in the customs service, the revenues available to the government to spend on the Afghan people, to pay for teachers and doctors and all of the other people on whom the public depend, have increased. We've also seen in several other ministries a real effort to tackle corruption, for example, in the Ministry of Mines. So there has been some very good progress in some areas, but it's still patchy, and as the Deputy Attorney General, as Dr. Ludin, the Chairman of the High Office of Oversight, have made clear, there's still a long way to go and further action is necessary.
How much impact these news have over the NATO mission in Afghanistan, especially when you go back to the NATO countries and they ask the same question from you?
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I think probably the biggest risk to maintaining the support of the publics of the alliance, all of the countries of the alliance, is the question of corruption. People ask themselves why it is that we're fighting and supporting a system that has this problem at its heart. They understand the threat the Taliban face. They find it difficult to understand the enemy within of the criminals who infiltrate government, who indulge in corruption, and who put all of us, mostly the Afghan people themselves, at risk.
Mr. Ambassador, President Karzai, on the day when he announced the process of the transition from the foreign troops, NATO troops, to the Afghan troops, he mentioned that this process is irreversible. What's your viewpoint about this?
He's absolutely right. It is and must be irreversible. We want to help build a sovereign Afghanistan that is truly exercising sovereignty. Afghanistan has sovereignty, but because of all of the problems it's faced, it hasn't been able to exercise. The government has been able to exercise that sovereignty throughout the country, and we want to help them achieve that goal.
Let's say if after the transition period, a potential threat posed to one of these areas which you will start to transfer the responsibility to the Afghan forces, and you see that Taliban activities or the Al-Qaeda activities over there. So what would be the NATO response to that?
Well, that's up to the Afghan government, of course. If they seek our support, then obviously we'll see what we can do to provide it. But the transition process is indeed a process. It is going to take time in every area that we begin it, and that's something the President made clear. So responsibility will be handed to the Afghan forces only when we believe they are capable of dealing with the threats that arise, and we will be able to provide quick reaction forces, emergency relief to those forces, until they can do that for themselves. And that's why it is going to take 3 years or more until the transition process is complete. And we remain available to provide whatever support the Afghan forces need through that period.
But if the Afghan government do not ask you, for example, if one of the district or the provinces fall down at the hand of the Taliban. If the government do not ask you for a help, so you will not take action from yourself?
No, we are, the NATO forces are in Afghanistan under a UN Security Council mandate to help secure Afghanistan. And we're here at the invitation of the government of Afghanistan. And in the end, the government of Afghanistan has the primary responsibility for securing the country. And we will provide them with the support they need, and the Afghan security forces need to do that. But the primary responsibility lies with them now, and it will lie with them in the future. And what we're seeking to do is to transition to them both the capability and the authority to exercise that responsibility throughout the country.
Mr. Ambassador, recently President Karzai criticized the international troops in Afghanistan, especially over the issues of the civilian casualties. And even in one point, he says the apology is no more accepted for them after the civilian casualties. How might this have an impact over the NATO, the relation between the Afghan and NATO, Afghan government and NATO forces in Afghanistan?
Well, so he's absolutely right to emphasize the critical importance of civilian casualties. In the end, all of us are fighting in Afghanistan to protect Afghan civilians, to protect them from the deliberate violence of the Taliban and the insurgency, who of course cause almost all of the civilian deaths that occur in this country. For us, one civilian casualty caused by us is one civilian casualty too many. And we've taken extraordinary steps to try and minimize the risk of causing civilian casualties through the very tough fight in which we are engaged. For example, General Petraeus, after recent incidents, ensured that every commander throughout the entire country reviewed with their troops all of the procedures to ensure they protected civilians. And even though we have more than doubled the international forces in Afghanistan just in the past year alone, the United Nations, an independent report, recognized that we had driven down the number of civilian casualties we caused by over a quarter. So I think we have a record that we can be proud of in seeking to minimize the number of civilian casualties, to drive it all the way down to zero if we possibly can. But of course, it remains a critical issue for all of us.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, in a very recent incident in one of the district of the Kabul city, a civilian were killed by the NATO troops, and I thought it had a bad impact over the, especially over the people who are living in a peaceful areas, especially in Kabul. People asking a question that why the international troops need to go, because this area is not that much at the hand of or at the control of the Taliban. Because even if you have a good coordination with the Afghan forces, so a normal policeman can go and arrest these guys. Why it's happening?
Well, I don't know the incident you're referring to, so you're
2 days back.
Well, you're providing me with details I'm not aware of. But NATO forces only engage in any kind of operation when necessary, and almost all of our operations are partnered with the Afghan forces. And sometimes the news pick up the fact that NATO forces are there and don't always note that Afghan forces were engaged in whatever operation it was as well. But we only engage in operations when it's necessary, and we only do so through partnered operations. If there is a civilian casualty, if we cause a civilian casualty, there is always an inquiry, and we always follow up to ensure that the right decisions were taken and that, for whatever reason, it was an unavoidable accident that we caused those casualties. If it was a bad decision, if somebody made a mistake, then we do take action either within the military chain or in some cases, if it was more serious than that, through the judicial authorities to ensure that that the people are held accountable for their actions. Yeah.
Did you think, Mr. Ambassador, that the NATO will take measures about the punishment of those people who are responsible, especially over the issues of civilian casualties, and also the compensation to the victims of these sorts of incidents?
Well, any time that we cause a civilian casualty, then families are compensated, and we follow up and do that very quickly. We also always engage with the elders and the leaders of the area, as well as with the family, to try and ensure they understand the circumstances in which the civilian casualty was caused. And that's true whether or not we believe we were at fault. If we were at fault, if it was an action where we made a mistake and got it wrong, then we follow up to ensure through the military chain or, if necessary, through the judicial process to ensure that people are held accountable for their actions and their decisions. And people have either been removed for their jobs or in some cases criminal prosecutions have followed if they have been negligent or if they have deliberately, as in in a case about a year ago, caused a civilian death.
Mr. Ambassador, in recent days, we witnessed sort of different demonstrations in different parts of Afghanistan, especially one incident in Mazar-e-Sharif was like a deadly incident in the UN staff lost their lives in Afghanistan. In a recent report, they also criticized the NATO troops in Mazar-e-Sharif that they did not provide security to the, even when they asked that they see a sort of danger to their life, but NATO failed to provide security to them. How do you see this incident?
Well, there is an inquiry going on by the UN into the incident, and that will include whether or not they sought and whether or not we provided the right kind of security support to them during that incident. And that was a tragic incident, and I condemn utterly those people who infiltrated what was otherwise a peaceful demonstration about the burning of the Holy Quran, but was a peaceful demonstration. A few infiltrators with weapons got into that demonstration and deliberately then used the crowd to attack the UN. And we must remember the UN have been in this country for 50 years, providing vaccinations and supporting the Afghan people through many, many difficult periods, including through the Taliban, the Civil War and the Soviet period. So it was an appalling crime that they were deliberately killed in this incident. There will be a full inquiry. Everyone will need to address whether or not we all reacted properly. But in the end, the fundamental question here is why a peaceful demonstration turned into a violent one. And we don't deal with public order. We don't deal with demonstrations. That's the responsibility of the Afghan police. And I think the Afghan police in that area have some hard questions to answer.
But did you think at some how that was that showed the failure of both Afghan and international troops?
Well, any incident of that kind, nobody can be satisfied with an outcome in an incident of that kind in which UN workers are deliberately murdered in what was otherwise the context of a peaceful demonstration. So all of us have to examine whether we acted properly, quickly and appropriately in that environment. That will come out through the inquiry. But the key point here, as I say, is how a peaceful demonstration was infiltrated by extreme elements and how they were able to use the cover of that demonstration to break into the UN compound. And that, I think, is the hardest question of all that everyone must answer. Yeah.
Did you think, Mr. Ambassador, that the elements of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda were involved in that? Or?
I simply don't know. Clearly, there were some violent and extreme elements who infiltrated that crowd. Whom they were associated with, where they got their weapons from, where the support was, what their plan was, I simply don't know, and let's hope that emerges from the inquiry.
Yeah. Are you happy with the way that the Afghan government handled that situation?
Well, I think anybody can be happy. You know, that situation of a peaceful demonstration ended up in the deaths of innocent UN workers, 7 of them. And of a crowd, and of course, and Afghan civilians as well, not only there and in Kandahar and elsewhere. So nobody can be satisfied with any otherwise peaceful protest against a very serious incident, the appalling act of the burning of the Holy Quran. But nobody can be satisfied if a peaceful demonstration turns violent and if people are injured or killed in that. Everybody must answer questions. But in the end, it's not always straightforward to police something of that kind. And the police forces had an enormous challenge on their hands. But of course, nobody can be satisfied if people have died.
So do you think it will have any impact over the transition?
No, I don't think this doesn't really relate to transition. The international forces in Afghanistan have never had responsibility for public order. We've never had responsibility for policing demonstrations, for dealing with riot control, or anything of that kind. That's always been the responsibility of the police force of Afghanistan and not ours. So it's not about transition. This is about the capability, the training, the conduct of the Afghan police, and we'll do our part in supporting that. But of course, in the end, it's a question for them.
Yeah, but you think, Mr. Ambassador, these incidents raise a serious question about the ability of the Afghan forces, how to handle the demonstration or how to handle the protesters?
Well, of course they raise questions, but policing very large demonstrations, particularly large demonstrations in which a few violent extremists infiltrate themselves and seek to exploit the cover of the crowd is very hard, and it's very hard wherever it happens in the world. We've seen that across the Middle East. We even saw it in London in a recent demonstration where a small group of extremists created a great deal of violence, smashed up buildings and hurt people. Now, fortunately, no one was killed in those demonstrations, but even there, with a very long-standing police force, they struggled to deal with containing the violence and containing that situation. So this is a very, very difficult challenge. And we must accept that if people are determined upon violence within a demonstration, it's very difficult for the police to prevent it altogether. And in the end, the people who are at fault here are the extremists who infiltrated that crowd, not everyone who tried to control it, although obviously we must answer all the very hard questions about whether we took the right actions and whether the police force took the right actions in trying to police that demonstration.
Mr. Ambassador, foreign media took that events as the uprising of the Afghan people against the foreign troops. How do you see this? Do you think it's
well?
right?
I haven't seen that in much of the foreign media, and certainly I don't interpret it that way. Those demonstrations, like demonstrations in Pakistan and elsewhere, were very clearly targeted against this appalling act against the Muslim faith of the burning of the Holy Quran. And those demonstrations were all about that particular incident. And actually, you saw very little in those demonstrations relating to the presence of international troops or indeed the other many challenges that Afghanistan faces.
So you think it's separate issues?
Of course, all of these issues in the end relate in one way or another, but I think fundamentally those demonstrations were a moment of protest against that act. And peaceful protest against that act is, of course, entirely appropriate. It's part of a democracy, but it must remain peaceful.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, people in Afghanistan think that the NATO was not that much quick to condemn that the act of burning of the Quran in the United States. Did you think
I just reject
point
that.
is valid?
I reject that. We made clear, even when it was first planned about 6 months ago, that the burning of the Holy Quran was a completely unacceptable act and was likely to lead to violence. General Petraeus said that 6 months ago when it was first proposed by this extremist individual and those associated with him. And as soon as it happened, we condemned it, and we made very clear we believe this is an act of aggression against the Muslim faith and against all peoples of faith. That's exactly what I said. General Petraeus has said the same. But we've also made clear, of course, that while peaceful protest against that is legitimate, violent attacks on the UN or indeed on anyone else, including on Afghan civilians, are entirely unacceptable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and thanks to come to our studios.
Thank you.